The next panel is really looking at the future of European. We've had quite lofty aspirations and some big movements in terms of policy to improve cancer control. But of course, this comes against the backdrop of some severe crises, COVID, the war in Ukraine, and these are having dramatic effects that were unexpected a few years ago, unexpected, and are putting pressure on budgets, putting pressure on political priorities, displacing people. So in that context, how can we continue to improve, what's it done to cancer control in the last 2 or 3 years, and how can we continue to improve that? So to help us all explore this, I'd like to invite our next panel up, please. So if I could invite Frances Fitzgerald, a member of the European Parliament. Thank you very much. Kate Rizvi, Executive Director of Youth Cancer Europe. Professor Jacek Jasem, who is Head of Department of Oncology and Radiotherapy at the Medical University of Gdansk. And Greg Rossi, who's Head of Europe and Canada Oncology. Yes, please do. Thank you. Head of Europe and Canada Oncology, AstraZeneca. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you. I'm Katie.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much. They're quite high up and a little bit uncomfortable, aren't they? But never mind. So I think I will start with you, Frances, if I may. So maybe you could give us your view on these crises and what you think the effect has been on cancer control and what should our response be? I mean, that's a big question, I know, and I'm only giving you about 4 minutes to put your opening pitch, but you know, some headlines of what it means and how we're going to respond.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everyone. Just by way of background, I'm a member of the European Parliament since 2019. Prior to becoming a politician, I was a social worker working in multidisciplinary teams in London and Dublin with a huge interest in healthcare. So this question of what we've learned from the crisis and how we move forward, I think is very pertinent. And looking at the last slide on inequalities, it strikes me that, of course, what happens in a crisis is that the existing inequalities get exaggerated and exacerbated in all sorts of ways. So the real trick and the clue is, how do we actually continue to prioritize cancer care on an ongoing basis and make sure it's higher up the priority level? Because what happened during the crisis, as we saw, is that there were many medical voices involved in our national COVID and international responses. I think in many ways, the COVID response was dealt with very well. But of course, what we saw was all of the other health priorities going down the scale and not keeping a voice effectively. That's what happened. And that's incredibly serious, as we see now with the kind of rates of cancer, the demands on our health services, and the catch-up that we need to do. So I suppose I'll say something very simple. As a politician, it's about keeping the voice at a national level in a crisis. And how do we make sure that the voice of cancer care and the professionals, the frontline workers, is kept during the course of a crisis? And I would say from my own political experience, it's extraordinarily difficult in a crisis, because even in political crisis, we see how a very populist view emerges. The demands of the crisis are so high that all of the energy goes towards that. So it is really about anticipating the next crisis, because we've seen this happen now, not just in COVID, but we've seen it happen during financial crisis, we've seen it happen during COVID and the Ukrainian crisis. So it is about that pre-planning, if you like, to make sure that we keep the voices of the specialists, the experts, to the forefront during a crisis. So there is a lot of pre-planning, I think, involved, and making sure that the voices, such as they are, continue to be heard. Sounds very simple, but we all know from experience how very difficult that is in a crisis. The second point I would make is, and I think it's come up in the discussions already, is very much around that the best way to do it is collaboration and the partnerships. I work on Transforming Breast Cancer Together. I'm chair of it. And I do believe that if you have the patient advocates, the pharmaceutical companies, the specialists, working together, you have a far better chance of the voice being heard and the needs being met. So I would stress partnership. I would stress partnership with politicians as well and bridge building between the industry, the specialists, the professionals, and politicians, so that the bridges that are needed to the political system, where the decisions are being made at a time of crisis, despite the very big medical involvement, of course, that we saw during COVID, I think those bridges are very important to the key political institutions that are taking the decision. And I think, again, in retrospect, you can see how very important that would have been at European Parliament level, at national level, and so on. That really makes a difference. I think there's been a time lapse in terms of getting the voice of cancer at as high a level as it needed to be during COVID. I think there are many lessons to be learned from it. But I'd go back to the existing inequalities. They get played out even more at a time of crisis. I think they'd be the key sort of introductory points that I would make.
Thank you, Francis. And actually, you've introduced our panel. You've mentioned that we need to come together as patient advocates, as specialists, and as industry, and as politicians. So I think that's great.
Yes.
And so let me come to now. What has been your experience, Katie, as Youth Cancer Europe, in terms of what's the effect that both the pandemic and the war has had, but also in terms of your sense that the patient voice is continuing to be heard through that sort of political storm and.
Thank you. So thank you so much for bringing this in. And I really appreciated your introduction and emphasizing the need of the voice of the specialists and who know the specifics of oncology heard throughout crises. But I would say that one of the most agile entities in the stakeholder ecosystem were actually the patient organizations that responded first, that gave hands-on support, that navigated patients, and also supplied very, very important intelligence and data that was not yet gathered in any of these crises. And patient voice and patient contribution to strategies was still a hustle. It was a hustle for patient organizations to be heard during the pandemic. It was a hustle during the Ukrainian crisis as well. Youth Cancer Europe was the first to respond to the Ukraine crisis. We responded in 2 days. In 48 hours, we responded and evacuated patients, and until now have placed patients in 18 European countries to continue vital cancer treatment so we don't lose lives. Yet, most decisions and strategies were still made behind closed doors, and we were not able to contribute with our intelligence, with our voice and our strategy. So I think there is lessons to be learned, lots of things to be very proud of in how crisis was dealt with in Europe. But I think there is still a better way that we can create in this partnership that we're talking about.
Okay, so that's really set us up for the next part of the discussion, which is how do we do that? Okay, so let me come to you, Jacek. Obviously Poland has been on the front line in terms of displaced populations from Ukraine. How have you responded in terms of delivery of care? Or what has been your experience?
Indeed, it was very challenging. Around 6.5, now even 7 million Ukrainians crossed Polish border. Around 2.5 of them have settled in Poland. So if you have such a population, which is equal to the population of some smaller countries in the European Union, of course, there are many cancer patients in this group. Some of them were diagnosed in Ukraine and came to Poland for therapy, which was not available in their home country, or was interrupted due to circumstances. And of course, since February, many of these patients developed cancer in Poland. We have to provide a care for both groups. It was very soon decided after the war started that the refugees will have exactly the same care as Polish patients. So it was very important because, of course, these patients had no Polish insurance. They had no Polish documents, anything like that. of course, they also faced not only health problems, but also many other problems, accommodation, employment, broken families. These were mainly women and children, because men, as you know, were not allowed to leave Ukraine. So the epidemiology of cancer among refugees is different, of course, by definition than the normal epidemiology of cancer in Europe. There are mainly female malignancies. Breast cancer is the leading malignancy, but also cervical cancer, because there is no population-based screening in Ukraine, so the incidence of cervical cancer is much higher than on average in Europe. And of course, childhood malignancies. And as far as children are concerned, there were, as opposed to adult malignancies, where patients were registered individually, then children patients, cancer patients, arrived to Poland in groups. For example, the entire hospital was evacuated, and we had a group of 30 small patients that we have to address very rapidly. As you know, childhood malignancies necessitate much prompter care than adult malignancies. So it was really challenging. Then, of course, there were other challenges, communication problems, psychological problems, and documentation was sometimes very scarce or missing. So imagine a patient who started radiotherapy in Ukraine is coming to Poland, and then we have to continue. We can't restart this therapy because the patient got a part of this therapy already in their home country, and we have absolutely no documentation. And contacting doctors in Ukraine was almost impossible because either the hospital didn't exist anymore, or there were other difficulties in contacts which made our role more challenging. So we faced these problems as much as we could. And the problem, of course, continues. Before winter, we expect another flood of patients. So, of course, we are doing our best. Poland has already faced, before the war, serious difficulties in cancer care, but we are doing our best.
It's heartbreaking to hear that story, and not only the inequalities that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, but to hear that sort of personal experience. It's moving. And maybe we can explore what you've learned and how you intend to respond, and what support can be given by other member states and the European Union as a whole. Greg, I mean, these crises are profound and they're disturbing. What is industry's role and responsibility in response?
Yeah, thanks, Vivek, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think a set of really important conversations. So I think there's a slight difference between the issues that we just heard, I think, very avidly described around sort of displacement of people both within Ukraine and then beyond their borders in Ukraine versus the pandemic. And so let me sort of address both of those slightly separately. I think in terms of the challenges and health system resilience that we saw during the pandemic, what the role of industry is. Can you hear me okay? I think I'm cutting out.
It's going in and out. That's okay, I think.
So the role of the industry, I think, during the pandemic was probably threefold. Firstly, I think innovation, which is what the industry does, is a critical part of that. Being able to deliver the vaccines, being able to deliver therapies for those patients, for example, with B-cell malignancies who can't elicit a response to vaccines, treatments. That's I think, an essential part and role, and I think actually was the industry at its finest. I think the ability to move quickly, despite the challenges, to be able to put on supply chains, manufacturing, clinical trials in that sort of context was a heroic effort, and I think a real acknowledgement to everybody who was involved with that. For me, I'm on the sort of the cancer side of our business, and so our sort of role was a little bit different as we thought about the implications. And so whilst we, I think, have created huge value and huge innovation over the last 25 years in cancer, a lot of that potentially is going to be eroded because of the impact of the pandemic. So, for example, I think the latest data are that there's over 1 million cancer screening tests that have been appointments that have been not made over 2020. Cancer's not going to go away. You know, those patients will progress. They will get detected later in the course of their disease. We know that treating patients early is a really important factor in terms of the potential for cure. And so we see those patients who are going to be engaging with the health system or are engaging with the health system with bulkier disease, with later stage disease, with different prognosis. So one of the things that we tried very hard to do, and we work with the patient groups and we work with a number of healthcare groups like FBO, like ESMO, to be able to indicate that patients really need to engage when they're symptomatic, when they're concerned about potentially having cancer. They need to engage with the health system. And so that was a big part of what we did. We also tried hard to say when they were diagnosed, were they getting the most appropriate care? So things like biomarker testing, so that we got the right workup and diagnosis. It was very difficult for a patient with lung cancer, for example, to get bronchoscopy, to be able to have a real detailed analysis of that particular lung cancer, because obviously there was the risks of nosocomial infection, so acquired infections in the hospital. The radiologists were busy sort of understanding treatment of COVID patients. So those sorts of diagnostic techniques were also basically being impacted. And so how we could sort of help with that was something that we tried to educate and engage. And then I think lastly, what is it that we could offer in terms of home support, treatments at home? What could we offer in terms of ways to use telemedicine technologies, applications to look at symptom and toxicity management so that patients could access care even without necessarily going into the system. So these are all the sorts of things that we were looking at and thinking about. And I think probably the legacy here is that we should really learn from this. I think what we learned very much was the systems could be flexible. We could really accelerate the engagement. So when it takes one day to go from CHMP opinion to a European Commission approval for a vaccine, rather than 60 days, there's sort of timings that we can sort of look at and say, how can we do that? I think access to care around Europe, around the HTAs, so the speed of access, looking at the quality of cancer medicine and cancer care. I think these are things that we need to look at and say, given this collaboration that we have now across and that we've experienced, how can we do more for what basically is a pandemic of cancer that we already just heard here in Europe, where a quarter of the global cancer cases are here in Europe. I think that's the legacy that we need to look at hard.
Okay. So there's lots to explore there. I have some questions, but I'll yield to the floor rather than my questions if you have any. But Katie, you want to say something?
Maybe on what you said, because of the Ukraine crisis, we have seen HTA approvals and access, the topic of access, being really flexibly handled for Ukrainian patients. And we've noticed this because as we were hustling to get different patients into different therapies in different countries in Europe, many times we actually needed to very quickly check if certain therapies were available to them, because we knew Ukrainians did not have access to those therapies normally.
Or they have to pay out of pocket.
Or they would have to pay out of pocket, and now it was available to them. So obviously we also see some of these journeys with patients who are actually leaving Ukraine, accessing some therapies and then going back home because maybe they deem the region safe. That's a completely different conversation, actually. The patient movement that we see that we have not seen in other crises, maybe even in other wars either, like when we think back to the Balkan conflict or when we're thinking about Syria. So very, very different, this war in Europe right now. But what we have seen is actually the pharma companies and access processes were so different and so quick and agile. And I wonder if we could take some learnings forward and maybe apply some of these principles and reevaluate how we talk about equity across Europe between different European member states, and to build a strategy that's actually put in place for the future, for any future crises. Because right now the Beating Cancer Plan only mentions technology and remote monitoring as some sort of crisis management approach, and very specifically referring to COVID, but does not have any crisis response built into it. So if we are going to build a crisis response in Europe, this would be something to think about. And the other one, as you said, you were talking about the 1 million not even delayed diagnosis, but no screening. Again, some of the first data about under-screening and under-treatment came in from patient organizations. Still, patient organizations are not on those meetings where ministers of health are discussing future priorities with the Commission or with European institutions or with international organs such as the WHO.
I suppose an important point to mention from a political point of view and a European point of view is that, of course, health is always seen as a national competence. But, of course, what we saw during COVID was the fantastic innovation and cooperation, which has still come up against that issue of a national competence, despite this being a period where there are unique lessons to be learned from COVID and from the Ukrainian crisis in terms of European cooperation and the benefits of that. So I think it's a unique moment, along with the Beating Cancer Plan, to really see the benefits of, it sounds a very simple thing to say, of cooperation across Europe. But actually it involves treaty change if you really want to get to handle that. And I think that's what you come up against in the various plans. So I think the public, there's a huge demand and need for the international collaboration at an even deeper level in terms of public health. And I mentioned two areas very briefly. The Protection Directive, which gave those traveling from Ukraine, all of the rights really of citizens in the other countries. In fact, how do you build health into that? That's very difficult at a time when people can hardly get accommodation and are moving from place to place. And again, it requires incredible flexibility and cooperation between the bodies we've spoken about to get the healthcare needs met of the population who are moving. The other thing is the civil protection mechanism, to make sure that that builds in an effective response, because it wasn't that effective actually at the beginning of COVID. That would be one of the European mechanisms that we had. So I think we just need to build in crisis much more into our thinking around the various European initiatives, and to make sure, we're speaking about cancer this morning, how do we make sure that the health cancer needs of patients are met in these crises? It's not simple, as we know, given the scale of the pandemic particularly. And I think, patients have suffered a lot, and professionals are under extraordinary pressure. And yes, there was great innovation in telemedicine and so on, but actually a lot of people have missed out on the very basis. How do you ensure screening continues in those circumstances? It's a very big challenge and needs huge flexibility when already. But I think public information is so basic at this time, but it really wasn't given out that much on cancer in the early days of the pandemic, despite the best efforts of all of the professionals in this room and elsewhere. It was slow. So I'd be interested to hear the views of the professionals who were trying to deal with this and the different member states, what the experience was.
Does anyone want to comment or have a question around that? Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I wanted to ask. So what you're saying. In a way, crisis is the norm. I know it's a particularly perfect storm at the moment, imperfect storm at the moment, but it's been the norm. There's been financial crises, there's political instability in member states, etc., etc. It keeps going on. So how do you? But then I suppose the critical question: it does seem obvious that this sort of pan-European approach, this collaborative, coordinated approach to care delivery, but also to things like HTA processes and to regulation. That all makes sense. What inhibits, I mean, it's made sense for decades to me, but what inhibits that and how can we progress that? And has there actually been a sea change in the approach to that because of these crises? There's questions. You had your volunteering.
Yes, I would actually like to comment on something. I know that now there are some studies coming out, but they are mostly just single-state studies on why some health systems have done better during COVID. And there are analyses of care delivery systems that may have done better as opposed to other models, but we don't have comparable data. We don't have large-scale studies. We don't have a crisis analysis plan still in Europe for oncology to very granularly look at oncology throughout Europe and see how different systems have dealt with it and where we have different results. We don't. It's just so simple. Right. But why don't we have this?
Of course, the current crisis has deeply affected cancer care, not only in Europe, but globally. However, there are some lessons that can be learned from the crisis that may, in the future, even improve cancer care and inform some solutions. A good example, of course, an obvious example is a rapid development of telemedicine, which was a necessity, particularly during COVID pandemic. So teleconsultations, telepathology, teleradiology, teleimaging. These approaches have rapidly developed, and some of them proved to be very effective. So you don't need to meet every day to commute from remote places to meet, to discuss the patient. We can do it online. Another solution which may be implemented, and this is in the best patient interest, is home care, which was much more common during a pandemic than before. For example, delivery of some medicines to patient rather than commuting patients to the institution. Changing the route of administration. For example, some drugs which were used almost exclusively intravenously have the same efficacy if given subcutaneously or orally. And of course, this route does not necessitate that many visits and that much exposure to infection than the home care. Some solutions are in development, and some of them are already tested in clinical trials, like home laboratory. So you can test, for example, your morphology at home with a small device connected with your smartphone. Another example, imagine it's 2020, April, during one of the phases of pandemic, waves of pandemic. And The Lancet publishes an article showing that delivery of radiotherapy in breast cancer in just 5 consecutive fractions in 1 week is as effective as 3-week therapy, which is a standard. So the patient spends, not hospitalized, but coming to the hospital only 5 times instead of 15 or 25, which was done 10 years ago. You might know, of course, I am a senior here in this room, but the history of radiotherapy says shortened schedules were developed during the Second World War. For example, in the UK, patients couldn't afford spending 1 month in the hospital, so they were treated with short schedules, which were then implemented. So this is a similar situation. Difficult situation necessitates some rational solutions, and some of them proved to be as effective as standard solutions.
Maybe a couple of additional comments, because I think it's an important conversation. I think, firstly, if we want equitable and high-quality cancer care, we've got to be able to measure it. Yeah. And I think we've already talked about this, in the previous session. But if we don't have, I think, high-quality integrated data sets that have the right level of biological information to be able to interpret it appropriately, I think we can't identify those best practices. We can't identify, and I think Francesca, Colombo presentation just really sort of focused on that. We can't identify what are the variables, what are the factors that are associated with outcome variability, because we don't know what the outcomes are. We certainly don't know what the variability is, and we certainly don't know what drives that variability. So I think integrated data at a regional level becomes something that's really important. And I will say that I think Europe is potentially at risk of being able to have some of the best data sets with individual member states. But as a region, I think we're falling behind, let's say, the US, where I think a lot of these integrated data sets, which have got, very significant biomarker information that are integrated into that, they're longitudinal, so I can look at the outcomes, I can look at them across sites of care, and I can look at them to be able to say what's actually driving great response, what's driving more resistant disease. What do I understand? The Tempus have a 510 gene panel that basically is integrated with their data set. We don't really have anything like that outside of maybe a few academic centers in Europe, and I think that's going to be something that's critical. The other thing I think that we need, and I think that we've seen with these two crises interconnected, is this flexibility to partner with the health systems. And one of the things that we face with a lot of the HTA agencies in Europe in particular is that cancer oftentimes have multiple indications, multiple potential uses. Sometimes it's in combination with another drug, sometimes it's monotherapy, sometimes it's in relapsing refractory disease, sometimes it's in early stage disease, sometimes it's treatment to progression, sometimes it's fixed course. So biology tells us and the clinical data tells us that the value and the costs are variable by indication, but the system says it's one price or nothing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we've got a system that allows us to create the flexibility of, I think, agreements and funding frameworks that really go across the entire, I think, continuum of cancer care for individual products. And I think that is something that some markets are now starting to do. Some are allowing us to go to indication-based pricing, average weight-based pricing, some with access in the presence of uncertainty, because maybe it's an early stage disease and we've got an endpoint like disease-free survival, but we don't yet have overall survival. So that flexibility is allowing us in some systems to create access, but in some systems, those sorts of things are barriers to being able to have, I think, rapid access. And I think that's another area that we can partner on.
Any questions? Yes? Who was that? Oh, yeah. No, let's wait for a microphone. That's right. Thanks, Alice. Thanks.
Marlene Wouters, I have two non-profits in prevention. But you can't compare the United States with Europe. We don't have a united Europe in health. Right. You know very well as pharma that there are countries, member states, that don't have availability to certain medication or not even refund if they get the medication. So it's not united.
Yeah, my comment was about integrated data sets, not around the access. But I think that the ambition that we should be seeking is what do we think is the best possible framework for understanding what works in cancer, where's the unmet need, how do we efficiently and effectively manage cancer most appropriately. And I think until you have data, and there's different ways to get data, and I think that there's a lot of work, in Europe that's on this, a lot of great initiatives, I think, sponsored by the European Union. But until you have data, it's very difficult for us to be able to analyze and get the insights that's necessary to be able to really come up with the ideas in terms of how to manage the entire budget or to be able to drive the outcomes to the best possible place.
You're so right. I mean, that is a huge issue. that we are so far away, whether it's in terms of access to pharmaceuticals, cost of pharmaceuticals, tendering. The question is, how do we take the best of what happened during COVID and apply it, to other areas? I suppose what we have to ask in this room is, what are the barriers to that at the moment, and how do we break them down?
Okay, we can't, let's wait for the microphone. But Francis, I just want to push a little bit on,
Yes.
on this point, and the point you're making as well, because it's my job to challenge a bit, is we do want a sort of unified approach, but on the other hand, member states are different. They are not just dealing with cancer, they're dealing with a whole range of not just health priorities, but other priorities. There is a balance to be struck, is there not, between setting out some broad sort of objectives and then allowing sovereign states to kind of, what is my priority and how should I spend my precious resources appropriately for me? And it might be, in the case of cancer, it might be that I've got big problems with tobacco control and that's where my priority should lie rather than something else. So, so how does one strike that? That is, I think, the balance that needs to be struck.
Well, look, the former speaker is right about data, but look at the data we already have. You take breast cancer. I mean, it is beyond outrageous, the differential in terms of access to screening, to therapies, and so on. So if the European Union, the European vision is to count for anything, surely it has to be about equality between states. And you're quite right, member states will want to define their own priorities, particularly in health, of course, because the competence is within the member states. But I think what we've seen incrementally, and especially through COVID, even though you say there's no comparison, what we have seen during COVID is that level of cooperation, of joint ambition, of joint access to treatment and vaccines and so on. Now, translate that. I'm not saying it's totally the same, but I think there has to be lessons, for the new pharmaceutical strategy, for example, which is really exercising the minds of everybody in the industry, that actually, if you ask the question, what's in the best interest of our citizens, what's in the best interest of patients, you do go beyond national boundaries, obviously. But it is a challenge for the system, I do agree with you, politically, as well as practically.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, another question here.
Yes, it's another question about comment on the legacy of the COVID crisis, about the clinical trials. So what we've seen in COVID, that there was a lot of bad clinical trials and patients misused, and that the right answers for treatments for clinical trials finally came from very good clinical trials like the recovery trial. Those were independent trials, collaborations between philanthropy and governments that gave the right answers, but then it was realized that the whole European system cannot take those answers because EMA can only deal with requests that come from the industry. So there we found a solution. In the case of COVID, you might remember dexamethasone that came out as a very good solution for treatment, but it couldn't be dealt with by Europe. And then finally, EMA found a solution by overruling their own system by the director of EMA. So they gave a scientific advice, but then nowadays we still have those interesting data coming out of independent trials where there's no commercial benefit, and we still don't have a solution. What the European Commission did now, they expanded the remits of EMA that only in case of a pandemic, the regulator will look at data coming from independent third parties and not from market authorization holders, but that's not the case for cancer. So my question is why? If we ask the question to Imer Cook, her answer is it's a matter of resources. They admit that indeed independent trials where there's no commercial incentive, and it's not a blame for the companies, if you have cheap solutions like dexamethasone was for COVID, then you cannot expect companies to act upon that, but you can expect Europe and the regulators to act upon that. So that's a question for the politicians.
Yeah, do you want? I mean, it's a broad question. I think it's a narrow question about that particular instance, but it's a broader question around flexibility of processes to deal with crises, and perhaps more broadly, an approach to innovation which is not necessarily around new biotech, but also existing, not only drugs and devices, but existing ways of working that we need to both introduce to the system and get rid of if they're not effective. I don't know, do you want to comment on that? And then there is another question on the floor, but any comments apart from registering that's an important point?
I mean, maybe as an industry response, I mean, these are non-industry sponsored trials. So I think it's really a question for the regulators. I mean, I think that in keeping with most industry players, we will provide, materials, analytical sort of frameworks and support to academic groups who are doing interesting research. And we support that. I think it's a good question to say, what's the end of that in terms of potential sort of uptake and utility and registration? I think it's that's an important question. It is a costly endeavor, as you indicate, no question about it.
My name is Parker. I'm from Genomics England. It seems that there's a call on the panel and from within the room to break down national and regional barriers. But I mean, I would just observe that yes, there are national boundaries within Europe. There are certainly state boundaries within America. If you look at individual countries, take my country, England, I mean, we have broken our genomics ecosystem into 7 regions. There's fragmentation and difference in clinical practices there. You get to much smaller countries with smaller populations. Australia, much smaller population, has exactly the same number of sub-regions. And within these regions, we have different health equity. We have different clinical practice, we've got different outcomes. So I'm really wondering whether across the world, healthcare just has this natural tendency to fragment. And I'd love to ask the panel if you think potentially a better way to manage this kind of perpetual fragmentation rather than trying to regulate it is just to encourage the European countries to publish outcomes, to make their outcomes, to standardize outcomes, to make it clear who's doing better and who's doing worse and why, and then let doctors and let patients decide, because it feels that regulation in all regions is failing kind of equity.
Interesting question. So the natural experiments, should we not harness the power of diversity of approach?
I mean, I think you sort of answered it a little bit in your question, which is I think that we absolutely do not want to limit any individual system, whether it's an academic system, whether it's a member state system, to be able to monitor, manage, understand, both the use and outcomes associated with it. I think that actually in, Genomic England, you're actually doing a terrific amount of work. I think one of the challenges that we see as at least me as an industry person, thinking about where unmet need resides and what's the biology behind the resistance to certain therapies and whether I need to intensify treatment, de-intensify treatment, stop treatment, and look at an alternative mechanism of action. It's really getting the biologic detail into those databases to be able to interpret it at a level that's useful. So I think for me, NGS panels, I think computational pathology that looks at multiple protein biomarkers, liquid biopsy to be able to sort of monitor over time, not just at sort of an individual, point in time, along with radiological information, imaging. That density of information becomes really quite powerful at a large enough cohort level to be able to understand that. I think that's one use. And then I think the comparisons across I think different health systems provides also valuable input to policy decision making.
Specific sessions later, we can explore more about the genomics data and genomics data coordination and sharing for insight, which I think might be your question, Benedict. So I think you might be on that panel. So anyway, Francis, you wanted to comment on this?
Your own question to a degree. I mean, it's how do you level up? How do you share the best information that you have? How do you have, what's the word I'm looking for? How can you share in an appropriate way at research? How do you keep creativity in Europe? How do you keep research in Europe? And yet, how do you level up the services? And, it has to be, I think, a combined approach, really. But given the inequalities that we see across Europe, I don't think there's any defense for not further engaging on a more macro level than we do at present. I think there's an inevitable move towards that. Whether it's in the area that's, very tricky to deal with of tendering for drugs, or whether it's in, let's say even the cross-border directive, using that more. Because at the end of the day, it's the patients who suffer. It's the citizens who will suffer if we don't do this. And we continue to have these huge regional variations. So, I mean, I think at a very macro level, we have to totally think about moving towards more European exchange, European best practice, European sharing of access to drugs, and so on. I think, nationally, we can't deliver the level of care that's needed in cancer, and I think that's becoming more and more obvious. Given what you talked about, about the new treatments and the pace of innovation, how do you keep up with that at a member state level? I think it's close to impossible. Now, the question is, has Europe got the mechanisms to make sure that we learn quickly enough and adapt quickly enough? And that's where I think the lessons of COVID come in.
Okay. Now, I've got a few seconds left, and I'm going to put you on the spot. This is a warning to other panels. Is there one thing that you think is tractable, which for you is a priority, which you really think is achievable to make a big difference to the future of cancer control, given the crises that we're in at the moment? Who wants to go first?
I would say to the professionals, keep your voice. I think that's the absolute critical on the front line all the time. And I think it's very hard for professionals because you're so busy doing everything else as well. But I think the voice at national and European level is so important.
Yeah.
I would make it more philosophical. I am from the country where the solidarity movement was developed, and I am from the city, from Gdańsk, where Valenza and I witnessed it, announced solidarity. So I would appeal for the European solidarity in these difficult times.
Thank you. Okay, I allowed one or two words each, otherwise we've got to close up. I'm already out of time, so you don't have to.
I think adopt screening and fund biomarker testing so that we can make sure that we're treating cancer patients appropriately.
Kate.
And in order to future-proof Europe's oncology, we need to build crisis preparedness into our strategy, and that will also deliver equity better than it is now.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.